Shelley Ball. Are you there?
I'm here. Hey, Kevin, how's it going?
Good, good. We're having a whiskey fireside chat. Cheers.
We are. Whisky, got my fire here. So, although, hey, we're what, the end of September, and I don't need my fire on yet. So.
No, it's getting close though. I still got my fake one. I think maybe in 2 weeks I'll move to the new one, or the real one. The whiskey I'm trying for this one, it's kind of weird. It's a whiskey that's made just outside of Algonquin. It was given to me as a gift.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so it's local. And
oh, that's interesting.
Copperhead Iron Cat. I mean, whoa, it's sweet. So I put a wee bit of ice in there. So you wrote a book, Shelley. Now I know you before you wrote this book. You have a history in outdoor education. You run a program called Biosphere Environmental Education Program.
How come the stars come to shine when it's dark from so far away and show us where we are? What makes the sun go to sleep every night, and what's it dreaming of? I wonder.
Yeah, exactly. So I run a kind of a social enterprise called Biosphere Environmental Education. And then kind of the flagship program within that is called the Youth Environmental Leadership Expedition. And so I take kids outside and it's been a 2-week program. And it's a fairly new program. Past couple of years, we've just been running it at the Queen's University Field Station, not far from here. I'm in Westport, Ontario. And yeah, it's kind of a combination of sort of, deep dive into environmental issues, getting kids out, young people out into nature. We engage them in learning leadership. So basically, helping them to gain their leadership skills and in the context of, we're not trying to sort of make young environmentalists of all these, these young people, but really what it comes down to is leadership and communication, as far as I'm concerned, are the 2 most important life skills really that apply to any career, any vocation that you're involved with.
That's awesome, because that's how I know you. I knew of you because of that. And all of a sudden I did not know you wrote a book on ticks and Lyme disease. And
yeah, life kind of takes you down certain paths, right?
So I'm reading the book, and the first part of it is all about how you got it in 2019.
Yeah, it's one thing I'll say is, very sadly, my story is an extremely common one. I talk to probably hundreds of Lyme patients, and it's very, very similar. And in my case, I live up between Perth and Westport, Ontario, and 15 acres of forested land. And like you, nature lover, outdoor, educator. I'm outside constantly, and I have been my entire life. And April of 2019. Gosh, typical thing. I was in the shower and I'm like, hey, what's that on my back? I could feel something, and then you get the mirror out and here's this engorged tick about the size of a pea on my back. And of course, I'm on my own. I couldn't get it off. So I went to Perth Hospital to have them remove it. And unfortunately, a really typical response when you go to the ER for something like that is, hey, can you send the tick off to have it tested to see if it comes back positive for Lyme? They're like, no. Well, they can actually test it. It's just that they choose not to because it costs money. So so I kept the tick, but never had it directly tested. Fortunately, there is a testing lab in Ontario now, run by Justin Wood. It's if you Google genetics, so spelled TICKS, genetics.ca. You can actually send your tick away to be tested for Lyme and other co-infections, but I didn't, I don't know that service was available at the time, or I didn't know of it. And so, the hospital gave me the typical 2 pills of doxycycline, what they call the prophylactic dosage, and said, oh, okay, you'll be fine. Well, 3 days later, I became ill with flu-like symptoms, and it kind of waxed and waned for, oh gosh, maybe about 3 to 4 weeks. And then I got really, really, really sick. And, just kind of through my own reading and kind of educating myself, I was like, oh my God, this is Lyme. I've got every symptom of Lyme. But I have an excellent GP, but I had to really fight to convince her that this was Lyme disease because my Lyme test was negative. I ended up going into her office, as a former research scientist, I can read the peer-reviewed science. So I ended up going into her office with this big honking stack of printouts of peer-reviewed research papers, kind of plunking it on her desk and saying, hey, here are 5 reasons why that test could be negative and I still have Lyme disease. But doctors aren't taught this in med school and they have no clue. And so I really, really had to fight to get 6 weeks of doxycycline. And unfortunately, 6 weeks is the maximum that a doctor in Canada can prescribe because Canadian doctors are essentially emboldened to the IDSA guidelines, Infectious Disease Society of America. And those guidelines do not recognize chronic Lyme as a real disease. They say you need, 10 to 14 or 14 to 21 days of doxycycline. A lot of the information that's in those IDSA guidelines are either 20 years out of date or they're not even science-based. And so most cases of Lyme disease, or many of them, are being missed. And so in my case, I was lucky enough to get those 6 weeks of antibiotics, but once the 6 weeks were done, oh my God, I felt much better on the antibiotics for those 6 weeks. But once they were done, I got even sicker than I was before. And by the time I hit September of 2019, I didn't think I was going to see 2020. I was so sick. I was in my doctor's office, my GP's office, and I was so sick. She sent me to the ER, the local ER, and she looked at me and said, it's really obvious that you are extremely ill, but she said, I have no idea how to help you. And one of the problems we face too is that because doctors are, emboldened to these IDSA guidelines, I don't say this with any malicious intent. I'm just trying to expose the truth or reality. But if doctors treat potential cases of Lyme with more than 6 weeks of doxycycline, they risk losing their license to practice medicine. Yeah.
Really? Rob, what's with that? Why is that?
Kevin, sadly, it's all politics. So because I think sort of a coterie of doctors in Canada are so adamant about following those IDSA guidelines, the worst part of it is that they're not even a standard of care. They're just guidelines. And there's a bulletin from, I think it's either Health Canada or the Public Health Agency of Canada from 2012. And it's a health bulletin directed to physicians in Canada. This is 2012. And here's the federal government saying to doctors, do not rely on the 2-tier testing for Lyme disease in Canada because it lacks sensitivity and it's extremely inaccurate. So you need to do a clinical diagnosis and just use the testing is kind of like a support tool. It's the other way around in Canada. They use the test to diagnose Lyme. They ignore the clinical diagnosis for the most part. As I mentioned in the book, there's been a really good meta-analysis done of the studies of this 2-tier antibody testing for Lyme, which is the standard that Canada uses. And if you have Lyme disease, the probability that test will detect it is on average about 54%. Wow. So you might as well toss a coin. The test is almost useless. A lot of it depends on what stage of Lyme you're in. Certainly those of us that are suffering from chronic Lyme, that test is highly unlikely to pick it up. And then in my case, I've most likely had Lyme since I was a kid. It just didn't really kind of boil to the surface until that 2019 bite. But I've had it for so long that my body is no longer producing antibodies to the presence of the bacteria. One of the scary things about Lyme, it's fascinating, like as an evolutionary biologist, it's fascinating, but as shall we say, as a host to the Lyme bacteria, it's pretty terrifying that these things are from a biological perspective, they're incredible. So they shape shift. The bacteria only stay in your system, your blood system, for a very short period of time. And they're these little, what we call spirochete bacteria, so like kind of like a corkscrew pigtail shape. And they burrow into tissues and organs in your body, and they can convert into a dormant phase, into a round body phase. And they can sit dormant in the tissues in your body for decades. So some people can get bitten when they're a kid, but not get ill until they're an older adult. And so this latent infection is extremely common. And, there's plenty of peer-reviewed science out there that shows that these persister forms exist, which is why once you kind of manifest Lyme disease, that's why it's so hard to get rid of. And yet, unfortunately, our doctors have no clue about this. And the medical professionals in our country that kind of set the policy for how Lyme is treated, they're completely ignoring the science. And I just the thought came to me recently. And again, I don't say this with any malicious intent. I'm just trying to reveal the reality that those of us deal with chronic Lyme disease. The medical community are like climate deniers in a sense. There's a huge body of scientific evidence on Lyme disease and co-infections that's grown enormously in the past, especially 5 years. And all of that science is being ignored by the medical profession in Canada.
Where did Lyme come from? Like that word Lyme, like, is it a new thing or has it been around for centuries or?
No, so Lyme, the term Lyme disease was actually coined by Willy Burgdorfer, who was, I believe he was an infectious disease doctor, medical scientist. And this was back in the late 70s, early 80s, and kind of like the famous case that brought the name to Lyme disease, but also the awareness was that there was I believe it was in the late 70s, early 80s, it was a case in Lyme, Connecticut, where there were a cluster of children and adults who ended up with really awful flu-like symptoms and arthritis, spontaneous arthritis. Aside from rheumatoid arthritis, who gets spontaneous arthritis? So there was this really weird, almost sort of, set of symptoms that a lot of the people in the community were experiencing. And so, doctors and scientists were brought in to try to figure out what was going on. And that's when when Willy Burgdorfer, isolated the bacterium that causes this disease. The interesting thing, though, is that the actual bacterium, so Borrelia burgdorferi, as it was named after Willy Burgdorfer, the fellow who discovered it. This bacterium has been around for millions of years, but sort of the human interaction with it, at least to this extreme, is pretty modern. It's quite a fascinating story from kind of the biology perspective.
It is fascinating, but is it expanding its range now in Canada? Like I live in the Kawarthas and we've never had ticks here. And now we have ticks and we have the dog ticks and we have Lyme in the last couple of years. Like, what's going on?
That's a really good question. And I think, it's hard to know if we kind of have a, sort of definitive answer on it, but certainly I think climate change is a factor. Our winters are not what they used to be. I mean, I grew up in Ottawa, and as a kid in the latter half of the 60s and the 70s, our winters were way harsher. We had a lot of snow, a lot of cold days, right? You remember, I don't know if you remember as a kid, having those beautiful blue skies on that really cold, crisp day kind of thing in the winter. We don't get that very often anymore. And so, ticks that previously say would have likely have been killed by those winter temperatures aren't being killed off, right? And so, our humidity has increased. It's hotter on average, sort of climate-wise. So I think all of these factors just contribute to the fact that ticks are probably better at surviving now because of the changes in our climate. Interestingly, I mean, people say, well, where do these things come from? Well, one of the biggest, I think, vectors for these ticks is, coming up from the United States on migratory birds. It's just that when those ticks got here, when they would drop off the bird or whatever, most likely that, winter would probably kill them. But our winters are much milder and these things are surviving. And we know that ticks are actually active in wintertime as long as the temperature is above about 2 degrees C. So if you're hiking in the woods in the wintertime, you still have to be careful. You have to still do your tick checks. And the other thing to be careful of is people who burn wood. We've heard cases of people bringing wood in from the wood pile. It might be a tick stuck underneath the bark of a log or something, a piece of firewood, comes in, warms up, starts crawling through the house and finds you or your pet and has a blood meal. And that tick could be carrying Lyme. So things that we, think of all the time that you and I spent outdoors as young people, we never even thought about this stuff, ever.
No, it's interesting too, because I know I paddle a lot in Quetico, and years ago, ticks are really prevalent there, but they weren't known to carry Lyme disease. And every night you would pick out of your body like at least 5, probably 10, and it became a running joke, like how many ticks you got, how many. But we also were told that they didn't carry Lyme. Now they're finding that some are. So it's expanding its range, right? So are those birds that are flying with the ticks, do they get Lyme disease?
That's a really good question. And I think it's kind of hard to, to kind of answer that. It's like, how do you define what Lyme disease is? Maybe, the question is, well, does the presence of those Lyme bacteria make the animal sick, whether it's a white-footed mouse or, chipmunk or a deer or migratory bird? And I think, I don't know that science sort of knows a definitive answer on that, but I think generally what our understanding is no. And part of the reason is because this, their sort of ecological interaction has evolved over, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of years. And so, however long those species, whether it's deer, various birds or whatever, they've probably been exposed to this in nature for, for generations and generations, right? And so, however many thousands, hundreds of thousands, whatever years those species exist. And so one of the interesting things in evolution, we talk about sort of the co-evolutionary arms race where, say a microbe or a parasite, infects a host, an mammal, and then, has a negative effect on them. But then, that mammal's immune system then, kind of counterattacks. And so as you can imagine, the host and the parasite are always kind of evolving to kind of stay one step ahead of each other. So the host, the mammal would evolve to have an immune system that would kill any of those bacteria, that it's infected with, but then the bacteria evolves to evade the host's immune system. What we think is that for things like white-footed mice and that sort of thing is that they don't actually get sick from it because their immune systems are used to having them on board. And so they just really become a reservoir for the bacteria, but they don't kill the animal. And even with us as humans, we're not kind of the sort of intended host, shall we say. I mean, nature doesn't choose, right? It's not, sort of conscious that way. But, I think humans sort of are kind of a natural sort of final host for this thing. And so our immune system, is probably not used to this bacterium. We're kind of still early in that sort of exposure phase in a sense. Although, what's interesting, I mentioned this in a book, and I think this is fascinating. I think it was called the Iceman, the mummy who was found in the European Alps. I think it was the Italian Alps. I think this is several years ago. And anyway, so they had this, wonderfully mummified man that they brought down from the European Alps. And, of course, did all kinds of DNA analysis on it. And one of the things that they discovered was that he had Lyme disease. Borrelia burgdorferi showed up in the tissues of this 5,400-year-old mummy from the Italian Alps. Wow. So interesting how, humans have been exposed to this thing. But again, getting back to your question, because of climate change. And then the other thing too is, we're seeing suburban sprawl. So we're seeing people living in, on the edges of cities at the border, of natural areas, or more people like myself who were, former sort of city dwellers who now live rurally, on acreage of woods. And so I think the opportunity for ticks and humans to come into contact has increased. I think there's a whole pile of reasons, sort of why, humans, I think, are being more impacted by these diseases. Certainly, I think the diseases are on the increase. We're seeing, we're seeing tick populations not just expanding. The science suggests that tick populations are actually moving northward by about 25 kilometers per year. So, I remember somebody saying to me, oh, well, there's no ticks in Thunder Bay. Well, apparently there are now in Lyme disease. So, so it's a very sort of real pattern that we're seeing. And even here in Eastern Ontario, the number of cases of another tick-borne illness, anaplasma, especially around, kind of Westport, Kingston area, I've heard more cases of people being hospitalized for anaplasma this year than the past, 3 or 4 years that have kind of been sort of following Lyme disease. It's wild.
Well, so you're terrifying me, Shelley.
You
are
still
there?
Don't hide indoors. That's not the solution.
No, and we will get to that because I think that's a really good point. But the whole thing is that people need to know is, are there certain ticks that actually have Lyme disease and others don't? And are there hot spots in the US and Canada that have more Lyme disease than others?
Yeah, for sure. Those are really good questions. So yeah, in terms of kind of who carries what, well, the black-legged tick, so Ixodes scapularis, the black-legged tick that is around Eastern Ontario, a lot of people refer to it as a deer tick. It's the same species. It's just, 2 different common names for the same thing. So they're known to carry Lyme disease, but they're also known to carry Bartonella, Babesia, Anaplasma. It's frightening. So here's one tick that carries at least 4 different infectious diseases that can do harm to humans. Another really interesting thing that has happened here in Eastern Ontario is really unusual, but this spring there was an absolute outbreak of American dog ticks. And, as you can imagine, I'm really aware of ticks and looking for them and kind of following what's happening. I had never seen a dog tick before. And interestingly, dog ticks, unlike black-legged ticks, were more in like wooded areas, that sort of thing. American dog ticks are more common in kind of like a farmland, grassy kind of, sort of environment. And so I gardened with a friend of mine over in Portland, and she lives in farm country or whatever, and very few black-legged ticks over there in the 4 years we've been gardening over there. And this year, oh my God, I think we collected 60 dog ticks. Each of us was bitten at some point. One of the reasons why we're concerned about that, the science suggests that American dog ticks do not carry Lyme disease. I don't know if we can say that with 100% certainty, but it appears not to be a common disease, a microbe that they carry. What they do carry, though, that concerns me is tularemia and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And Rocky Mountain spotted fever is one of the more dangerous tick-borne illnesses in North America. If you have a compromised immune system, you're bitten by a tick carrying Rocky Mountain spotted fever and it's not treated, it can be fatal. So,
are you serious? Like, look, I don't know if I can find it in your book here really quickly, but yeah, like there's a picture of that in here. Oh, I gotta find it. Yeah, here it is. Like that.
Yeah, isn't that wild? That's a good point, Kevin. Here's the interesting thing. When I finally found a Lyme literate doctor in Toronto who's been treating me since the fall of 2019, he's one of Canada's greatest Lyme experts, medical doctor. And so he knows what to test you for. One of the problems is that the testing for Lyme, but even the co-infections like Babesia, Bartonella, all those tests are terrible. So you really have to focus on a clinical diagnosis to diagnose Lyme and the co-infections. The interesting thing is I tested positive for Rocky Mountain spotted fever and Q fever. And he said, thank goodness you don't have an active infection. So what you can do is, it's an antibody test. It's one of the antibody tests that seems to be fairly accurate. And so you get 2 different kinds of, antibodies that it detects, an IgM, which generally means you have an active infection, and then IgG antibodies, which are evidence of a past infection. And he says, well, you've got IgG, but not IgM antibodies. And so he said, and you obviously don't have any of the clinical signs of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but you've been exposed to it at some point. And so then the question becomes, at what point in my crazy life, traipsing around the world, in the woods, and whether it was Costa Rica or, Missouri, where I did my PhD, or, wherever, when did I get bitten by some tick or some other arthropod that was carrying this stuff? And I don't ever remember being sick from it. I never got that spotted, rash. So it's weird, really weird.
Yeah, let's look at the symptoms of it too. Like, so we're always told that actually you're going to have a rash, and you said you didn't, and then you got it. But what are things that people should look at on their body? Like, well, I think you said it.
Yeah.
You said you started feeling bad. You started feeling you had the flu. But,
right. So flu-like symptoms are probably the most common initial. There's various phases of Lyme disease depending on how long you've had it, and in that initial kind of early acute phase, having flu-like symptoms. So headache, really tired, achy all over, just not feeling well, low energy, that sort of thing. It's almost like when you're first starting to get like a serious case of the flu. So you haven't kind of, hit rock bottom yet, but you're kind of on your way down and you're just not feeling good. Kind of starts that way. And then it just gets more and more intense. And if it's caught early, so if you're given a sufficient course of antibiotics, right? Because remember, Lyme is a bacterium, so antibiotics will kill it in theory. One of the things that we pretty much know is if you're infected with a tick with Lyme disease, you really need to get a serious dose of antibiotics, typically doxycycline, on board in the first 7 days within that bite. Any longer than that, and the risk, of contracting chronic Lyme appears to be quite high. So you really have 7 days to get those antibiotics on board after the tick bite. One of the challenges is, like in my case, it took me 7 weeks to convince my doctor that I had Lyme. So I was, way past early phase Lyme by the time I actually got the doxycycline, which means then that the antibiotic has less of an effect at killing the Lyme. And as we were talking about earlier, it's likely actually because of my, my personal history of, tromping around, meadows and woods of Eastern Ontario since I was a little fart, that I've probably been carrying the Lyme bacteria since I was a kid. But I didn't get really sick until, my mid-50s, when I had that bite in 2019. And so it's possible to have what we call a latent infection, where you're infected with that bacteria, but it doesn't necessarily make you sick right away. It can sit in your body for months, years, even decades before it becomes a problem. And typically it becomes a problem when your immune system, when your immune function decreases. So either as we age, or you have some other illness or really stressful situation, that sort of thing. So, but back to the symptoms though, I'm glad you mentioned the rash, because a lot of people think, okay, if I don't have a bullseye rash, then I'm fine. There's some really good peer-reviewed science out there that shows us that the percentage of cases of Lyme disease that present with the bullseye rash is under 10%. So most people with Lyme do not show the bullseye rash. I've been bitten many times in my life. I've never had a bullseye rash. As I show in the book, there's a lot of different forms that a Lyme rash can take. In my case, in 2015, I had what I thought was a spider bite, and it was just a solid red oval patch with a little hole in the center of it. And I thought, oh, it's spider bite. Never thought anything of it. Well, 2016 was when I first started not feeling well, and ended up with like just a really chronic feeling of burnout. Turns out that was actually Lyme disease. And so I was becoming sick from Lyme, but it wasn't until the 2019 bite that I got really, really sick. So, really important take-home message for viewers is that, if you have the bullseye rash, you have Lyme disease and you need those antibiotics right away. If you don't have a bullseye rash, you can still very easily have Lyme disease. And the tick that was taken off my back at the hospital in 2019, there was no rash at all. And that was the one that just killed me. So, we have to be really careful about the information that's being shared with the general public about, what tells you if you do and you don't have Lyme. So again, getting back, the symptoms are the important thing. Like, doctors know that they need to do a clinical diagnosis based on the patient's symptoms, their history. Like, are they outdoorsy like us? So we're spending a lot of time outdoors where your likelihood of running into tick can be higher, especially if you're not taking precautions. That's really important information. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I think people have heard this in the media, but you really need to cover it. How do we protect ourselves? What do we do?
Yeah, That's a really, really important question. I think, you and I as promoters of nature and outdoors, I think this is a really important message, for the folks that we interact with, and that is, don't hide inside. Go out and enjoy nature, because you cannot let ticks sort of, hold you hostage inside your house. There are things that you can do to decrease the likelihood of a bite. And one of them is to use a repellent. Now, a lot of people, growing up, hey, there you go. Exactly. Perfect. That's the kind of stuff you want to get. And a lot of people, hey, when I was a kid, when we were camping, for mosquitoes and black flies, we always used DEET. The really good news is that there's a newer product on the market, and the active ingredient in it is called icaridin. And it is highly effective against repelling ticks. And the great thing is that it lasts for 12 hours. Whereas DEET, you would have to reapply that about every 3 to 4 hours to keep the ticks off. And so you can just go to your local hardware store, go to Canadian Tire, Shopper Drug Mart, that kind of thing, and look for insect repellents or mosquito repellents or whatever that have icaridin in it. Spray that stuff on you, first thing in the morning before you go out for your hike, and take the bottle with you. But it's highly effective.
I went to Mark's Warehouse, and I meant to find that shirt of mine. I got it on sale. There's a shirt now that you can buy at Mark's Warehouse that actually has Parethin. No, I can't pronounce that. Parethin.
Yeah.
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 And it did work. They landed and they got dozy and they fell off. I did find the shirt, because it was 2 layers, because they don't want it touching your skin, was really hot during the heat wave. So it wasn't.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually, because especially like in July we're so hot and humid, but I think it's a really good good method of protection. Interestingly, so those clothes are embedded with a chemical called permethrin. And permethrin isn't just a deterrent, it'll actually kill ticks. One of the issues with permethrin, and I would highly recommend, those permethrin embedded clothes from Mark's, because I've heard that they work really well. I don't personally have any, and the only reason why is because permethrin is toxic to cats, and I have 2 cats. So I just want to make sure that they're not, you don't leave the shirt out and they're chewing on it or something, And so the other thing with permethrin is that it is actually a pretty nasty chemical if you apply it directly to your skin. What you're supposed to do is only ever apply it to your clothing. For me, the icaridin just seemed to be a really good kind of product where it's safe. I've looked at the material safety data sheet on it, and it's pretty safe chemicals. So you can put it on kids. There's a kids version. I think if you want a really good, safe way to enjoy the outdoors, I think that's a great product. But, that's one step of the preventative thing, right? The other thing is, when you're out exploring the outdoors, do tick checks. And I know a lot of folks will say, like public health will say, well, stay to the path and don't walk through long grass. And yes, I think those are really good suggestions, but you and I like to get off the beaten path and get out into the forest. So I do, even though I have chronic Lyme disease, I still do. But, I wear the icaridin, repellent. I'm usually out there hiking in shorts. I don't like wearing pants tucked in and that sort of thing. I actually want to see the thing crawling on me, to be honest. So I don't do those sorts of things. But one of the things that I will do is I will, periodically just sort of check myself to make sure I don't have a tick crawling on me. And if I do, remove it. As soon as I get home from hiking or even gardening in my backyard, as soon as I come in, the first thing I do is I peel off my clothes. I stand in front of a full-length mirror. I check everywhere to make sure I don't have a tick on me. Then I hop on in the shower, because if the tick is crawling on you, but it's not embedded, so it's not feeding, as soon as the water hits it, it'll pop off. So one of the best things to do is either have a swim, have a shower, a bath, soak in the hot tub, just, get yourself wet. And so any of those ticks that are crawling on you will hop off. And while you're in the shower, if you've got a dryer there, the clothes that you were wearing when you were outside gardening or hiking or whatever, pop them in the dryer on high for about 20 minutes. And that should kill, any of the ticks, especially the smaller nymph ones that are harder to see. Yeah, because if you just pop your clothes in a laundry hamper or something, they can easily just crawl out, and they're like little heat-seeking missiles. If there's a mammal in the house, a human or a dog or a cat, they'll find them. So
There's country and western songs written on tick checking. It's like
no way.
They sing it like foreplay.
Jeez.
Oh no, it's hilarious. When I paddled in Nova Scotia, a lot of tick in Nova Scotia.
I'm
And
gonna say that. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
yeah, and what we would do at night is that we would get the whiskey out, and whoever had a tick on, you get a shot. Right? It's almost like, I guess what I'm getting at in Maine, when I go to Maine, go paddling in Maine, ticks are normal there. They're not afraid of them. It's part of their lifestyle. They make fun of it. So whereas now where I live, people are terrified. And that concerns me, because people are saying, well, I'm not going to go out in the woods anymore because I might get a tick. And I might get Lyme disease. And where if you go to places where historically they've always been around, they kind of laugh at that. Like, well, yeah, that's called life. Right. So
that's a really good point. One of the things, I think I mentioned this in the book, and one of the things that I say is, ticks are just part of our reality, ticks and Lyme disease. And, I don't want anyone to have to go through the hell that I and others with chronic Lyme have been through. It's horrendous. I've spoken to Lyme patients that have also been cancer survivors, and they said, given the choice, they'd sooner have cancer. Because at least cancer is recognized as a disease, if there's a treatment for it. Those of us with chronic Lyme, because our medical system in Canada doesn't recognize it as a real disease, they won't treat you. So I've spent $30,000 out of pocket to get treatment from a private clinic to try to get my health back to the point where I'm functional. And the sad thing with chronic Lyme is that typically, I think we don't have the final word on the science, but because of the persister form of the bacterium for Lyme, as well as Bartonella and Babesia, and some of the other co-infections, I'll have this for life. And so really what your goal is when you're in chronic Lyme is to get yourself well again and get yourself into essentially remission and stay there as long as possible. And when you have flare-ups, you manage them through medications, herbal remedies, that sort of thing. So it's it is a very big piece of our reality. And you're right, Nova Scotia, Maine, the whole eastern seaboard, tons and tons of ticks. Ontario is really bad. BC is starting to get bad. They're starting to see ticks in places they never had. And the other thing to realize is that just because there's a tick there, that tick doesn't necessarily carry Lyme disease. It depends on where you are. In eastern Ontario here, and especially kind of in the kind of kind of Westport, Perth, Kingston, kind of the Ottawa to Kingston sort of corridor here, we're in a Lyme hotspot. And there was some research done by a prof at Guelph, I don't know, several years ago, who not far from here did some tick sampling, and 80% of the ticks that they captured were Lyme positive. And yeah, and I've had 2 tick bites this summer. I was actually just reinfected with Lyme and Babesia 3 weeks ago. So I now have acute Lyme and Babesia, and I have chronic Lyme and Bartonella. And so now I'm on treatments to try to manage the chronic stuff as well as the kind of active acute infections. And it's brutal. It's just awful. But it's, as I say, I think we really have to realize that this is part of our reality and find a way to live with it. And in the book, kind of I guess a comparison I give is, when I was an undergrad, I was lucky enough to spend a couple of weeks up in Churchill, Manitoba on a field ornithology course learning about birds. And it was really interesting. It was in the summertime, and it was really interesting talking to residents there because, of course, they have polar bears to contend with. And, they can be dangerous animals, right? They're wild animals. They don't go out there with intent to eat people or whatever, but it's just, interactions happen. And so the residents of Churchill have taken measures to be able to coexist with bears. It's a risk for sure, but they have ways of coexisting peacefully. And I think that's kind of a mindset that we need to embrace with ticks, and just realize that this is part of our reality now, whether we like it or not. And so I think the important thing is to say, okay, given that we have these ticks, what are the measures that we can take to go out in nature and enjoy it safely? And as we've just discussed, I think, there's repellents, there's tick checks. I do at least 2 tick checks a day. I do one as soon as I come in from the outdoors. I do one before bed, and I do one when I get up in the morning. And people say, well, why the heck would you do a tick check in the morning? You've been asleep. Well, a nymph tick can be the size of a speck of pepper. And so it's really easy to miss it. If that speck of pepper-sized tick, was feeding on you overnight, it's going to enlarge because of the blood meal it's had. So you're more likely to spot it. So that's why I do a tick check when I get up in the morning in case I missed anything. And not great if the thing's been feeding on you overnight, but at least you'll see it. And then the really important thing is that if you find a tick on you that has been feeding on you, doesn't matter if it's been on, for 5 minutes or 5 days, take that tick and save it. And then you send it by mail to a company, a private lab called Genetics, so GENETICKS. So if you just Google genetics or www.genetics.ca, for a small fee, you can pay $50 to have it tested for Lyme disease. They'll use PCR, so they'll basically do a molecular test to look for the presence of the Lyme bacteria in that tick. And so I think it's $50 for Lyme testing. For $150, they'll test it for all of the co-infections that we're likely to have here in Eastern Ontario. So Bartonella, Babesia, Anaplasma, Ehrlichia, all of that stuff. And all I can say is that is money well spent, because if you know that tick is Lyme positive, you need antibiotics right away. So, but here's, I want to follow this because here's a really important point. Even if that tick tests positive, we're hearing Lyme patients say that, they get the tick tested, it's positive. They go to their GP and some GPs go, oh, okay, we better give you some doxycycline, some antibiotic. But then other doctors go, no, I didn't see a bullseye rash, so you're fine, don't worry about it. That's the worst thing that they can do. If that tick that bit you comes back positive, you absolutely need to get those antibiotics ASAP. And so a new service has just popped up in Ontario, and I don't know if it's going to be expanding beyond our borders. It's just brand new here, but it's called Tick MD. And so if you just Google Tick MD, it'll pop up. If you have a tick bite, you find that engorged tick on you, save it, go online, book an appointment with Tick MD, and you'll get access to a Lyme literate doctor. And that doctor will take your history and what's happened and what are your, if you've got any symptoms or not. Hopefully not, you were just bitten by the tick right away, and so you get on and book that appointment. And I have a case of a friend in the Perth area who had an engorged tick on her chest and went to the hospital, had it removed. They would not give her the 6 weeks of doxycycline. They'd only give her the 2 pills, the 1 dose, which does nothing, by the way, it's useless. It pretty much only guarantees that you have a negative Lyme test is what it does. So if I ever had to go to a hospital again to get a tick removed and they handed me the 2 pills, I'd say, keep it. I don't want it. I wouldn't take it. It's useless. And then I'd go to Lyme literate doctor to get the 6 weeks of doxycycline. But yeah, it's really important to get that tick bite treated as soon as possible. With Tick MD, what's great is that they'll say to you, hey, did you see the tick on you and did you save it? And if the answer is yes, they'll say, send it to the genetics lab, get it tested, and then let me know what the results are. And if the tick comes back positive, they'll prescribe 6 weeks of doxycycline. So whereas going to your GP or to a local ER, you're more likely to have them say, if you don't have symptoms, we're not giving you any antibiotic. This service will basically give you the treatment that you need right away. And here's a really important point is that, as I say, it's our GPs are not being taught properly about how to diagnose and treat Lyme disease or other tick-borne illnesses in med school. So the problem is that we need to educate them about the current science of Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses. It's not happening though, but I think it's really important to to really kind of self-advocate and to make sure that you get the doxycycline as soon as possible. Some of the things that you might hear from your GP is, oh, if the tick hasn't been on you for, if it's been under 48 hours or under 24 hours, don't worry. Well, there's science that says that, Lyme can be transmitted in under an hour. So if that tick's been on you even for 20 minutes, get it off right away, get onto the antibiotics. And I realize that there's concern about, antibiotic overuse, but here's what I don't understand is that somebody like me who's really ill with Lyme disease cannot get antibiotics from our doctors in our publicly funded healthcare system. And yet, my friend's teenager who has a really bad case of acne, they'll give them 4 months of doxycycline, the same antibiotic they prescribe for Lyme disease. They will give that teenager 4 months of doxycycline without batting an eyelid. And yet those of us who are debilitated, and so sick from Lyme disease cannot even get the same antibiotic. So I don't buy the antibiotic, overuse argument, against Lyme.
I'm laughing because I thought they didn't do that anymore. When I was a teenager, I had really bad acne, and that's what the doctor gave me. Just drug me up, get rid of the acne. Oh my Lord.
Oh, wild.
Amazing. Yes, everybody's going to be itching tonight and doing tick checks and doing the foreplay, whatever. I don't know, but I did not follow the script whatsoever. But I do have one. I was reading this book. It's so funny. I was reading this book throughout the few days when it was at Christine's place, and she lives near Kingston. And then we went for a hike. I never sprayed so much of this on in my life. But the one question is it true? I'm reading this book. Is it true that you can actually get Lyme disease by having sex with someone that actually has Lyme disease?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a highly, highly controversial thing. And, very kind of emotionally charged. And as I say, unfortunately, our current medical system is so far down the denial hole of the science of Lyme and tick-borne illnesses. And so, most doctors in Canada will tell you, absolutely not. And yet there's plenty of anecdotal cases, but there's also peer-reviewed science that shows that Lyme bacteria have showed up in semen and vaginal secretions. And there are plenty of cases, anecdotal cases of, hey, somebody got Lyme disease and then their partner, their husband, wife got sick. The other thing too is Sue Faber here in Ontario has spent a lot of time researching sort of mother to fetus transmission of Lyme. And there's scientific evidence to back up that it can be actually transmitted from mother to fetus, in utero. And so, so there's concerns, if babies are being born with Lyme disease because mom had it and it was never detected, never treated properly. It's a good question, and it's a very, very controversial topic, but there's certainly scientific evidence to suggest that the answer is yes. I think one of the things that really concerns me is, even if there was the risk of this, wouldn't you take the conservative approach and say, okay, well, we're just going to assume that it happens and we're going to take the precautions, as opposed to, let's just wait and see. It's like what we were talking about getting access to antibiotics. Most of the doctors in Canada will say, oh, well, I'm not going to give you doxycycline, let's wait and see if you develop symptoms. Well, that's just absolutely ludicrous, because if you've developed symptoms, you're already so far down the Lyme disease hole that it's unlikely that those antibiotics are actually going to eradicate the bacteria. And then you end up with this latent infection and potentially end up with chronic Lyme disease like myself. I mean, I've spoken to Lyme patients, and just one very recently, a local couple that I connected with. And this poor woman has chronic Lyme disease, and she is so sick, she's barely standing. She's probably about 5'10" and 84 pounds. She's just so thin, and no doctors will help her. She's had to go to the same private Lyme clinic in Toronto, where I've gotten treatment. And my heart aches when I see that sort of thing. I mean, she's far sicker than I ever was. And trust me, I was really sick. I mean, I was so sick, my GP sent me to the ER because she was panicked for my condition and how sick I was, but didn't know how to help me. And so when you see people like this, you think, how can we let politics ruin people's lives? People end up in wheelchairs from Lyme disease. Lyme can Lyme doesn't, getting back to symptoms, Lyme doesn't just affect you in terms of those flu-like symptoms. Those are the early stages. But when you get chronic Lyme like me, so, I've got arthritis because of Lyme disease. What it does is it actually Lyme manipulates your immune system. And so it causes inflammation of your joints. That's one of the many ways that Lyme interacts. So, I have enlarged joints in all of my fingers, my wrists. Migratory joint pain is a really, really common symptom of kind of mid to late stage Lyme disease. And so the first thing your GP is going to do is test you for rheumatoid arthritis. When it comes back negative, they're like, oh, I don't know what's going on. It's Lyme disease. Later in Lyme disease is often when the neurological effects of Lyme hit, and they can be severe. And we haven't even talked about co-infections, but Bartonella, Babesia, those are two very, very common co-infections with Lyme. And when you have those co-infections, because again, they're injected into you through that tick bite, it makes it much harder to kill Lyme and those co-infections. So I have chronic Bartonella, and it's truly hellish because it inflames your brain tissues. So it leads to short-term memory loss, problems with word finding, problems with cognition. It can lead to anxiety, depression, rage. Bartonella rage is really common, and I go through it all the time, and it's a living hell. It's absolutely, it really messes with your, the psychiatric symptoms that Lyme and Bartonella and Babesia can cause are horrendous. And thank God this is much less common, but Lyme disease, the Borrelia bacteria, can actually cause something called Lyme carditis, which attacks your heart and affects the electrical transmission within your heart. So there can be some really serious, kind of acute impacts of Lyme disease. Luckily, Lyme carditis seems to be, relatively rare, but these other chronic effects of, the joint pain, joint swelling, the neurological effects of Lyme, those are very real, and it leaves people so debilitated they can't work. And yet our medical system says, oh, you don't have a disease, go see a psychiatrist. That's not helpful. And so this is a real disease, and a lot of us are doing a lot of work to fight to get chronic Lyme recognized as a real disease. And I think, just to kind of finish up, something that I think kind of gives us hope, but is also frustrating at the same time, is the symptoms of chronic Lyme and COVID long haulers are very similar. And yet, if you're a COVID long hauler, doctors are like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do for you? And they recognize it. And yet those of us with chronic Lyme go through the same hell in terms of the symptoms. And yet we're told, go see a psychiatrist because there's nothing wrong with you. And we're really suffering. And, as I say, some people are in wheelchairs because they're so debilitated from this disease. So, we've got a real fight on our hands to sort of battle the system here in Canada to get them to recognize chronic Lyme and to treat it, because if they don't, a huge proportion of the Canadian population is going to be carrying, these Lyme bacterial co-infections and have chronic illness, which is very debilitating. And if you consider the, kind of the socioeconomic impacts of chronic illness, it's a huge burden on a medical system. And I say, pay now and treat it now and get people well again, instead of just ignoring it and dealing with a lot of chronically ill people. So it's quite the thing here in Canada.
Well, thank you, Shelley. Wait a minute.
Are you gonna?
Yeah, because I'm taking the dog out for a walk. No, I'm just joking. I'm going to take a double shot of that after that interview. Oh my God.
Kevin, dog out for a walk though, you know what I do? If I take the dog out for a walk, I spray Carradine from the knee down.
Yeah.
And, just spray your pant legs or whatever, just in case. Because the thing too is, remember that ticks don't like hot, dry weather. They like they like moisture, they like humidity. So we kind of have like our tick season in the spring, but we're just kind of starting our second tick season now because, the rain is coming back and they really like these conditions, even if it's cool. So just because we're, it's getting cooler, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be putting that spray on.
No, in fact, I'm going to Frontenac in about a week with my hot tent, which has no floor. And what I found a few years ago during the same time of year is that you put the tent up, you got the stove going, and you can actually see the ticks in the grass and you think, hey, I'm okay because it's cold. But then that tent is getting warm. Where are those ticks going, right? So, and I actually think a lot of old explorers like David Thompson and all of them, I think they had Lyme. You can look at his history and how his health depleted. I think he had it, but nobody knew they had it. So.
Yeah, I don't doubt it, and to be honest, I think anybody in Eastern Ontario who's a farmer, an arborist, working in agriculture, and anybody who's got a profession where you're working outdoors, those folks are at high risk. So it's really, really important just to take those precautions, to go out and enjoy, the outdoors safely. But again, I think the reason I wrote the book was I realized that because we don't have any help from our medical system, we live in a country with a universal healthcare system, but there's nothing universal about it. Unfortunately, as a Lyme patient, we're actively discriminated against. And so what I realized is that you have to help yourself. And so for me, as a research scientist, because I've got the science background, and I'm not a Lyme expert at all, but I can read the peer-reviewed science out there on Lyme and tick-borne diseases. And that's kind of why I wrote the book, was how do I take this information that's really important for us to understand, to keep ourselves safe, and distill it down into a form that the average person without a science background can read and understand? Because if you do get Lyme disease, you have to be your own vocal advocate. You have to educate yourself. You have to understand that just because your Lyme test was negative doesn't mean you don't have Lyme. And then you're going to find yourself having to then educate your family doctor about this. Take my book with you and say, look at this, read this. This references the peer-reviewed science, and I think, where change is really going to happen, the change that we really need, is to get our family physicians and our ER physicians educated about the truth about Lyme disease and to embrace that peer-reviewed science that's out there. And I think once we can do that, things will be much better in terms of people getting the treatment and the early diagnosis that they need. It happens in European countries. They're far, far ahead of us in terms of how they diagnose and treat Lyme. And so I think we really have to look to them to say, hey, let's look at a model for how we can do this better.
This is an amazing book. So to end off with, it's kind of a running joke. So I read this book in 3 days. I was like, oh my God. And so we went out for a hike near Kingston, and my partner Christine goes, are you worried about ticks? No, I've got Shelley. We're fine. We're good.
I'm Kevin. Hey, cheers. Well, cheers.
Awesome book. Congratulations.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. Cheers.
I think I got a tick.
You're going to be scratching for the next hour.
Oh, we call that phantom ticks when we go camping. You pick them all off and you're in the tent and you still think you have them.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh my Lord. Okay, take another shot for that.
So wait, I got an idea. When you go camping, take the book and your scotch.
Yes. And then just hit the ticks with a book. Thank you very much. This is fantastic.
Thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate being able to chat with you and to share the Lyme story with everybody.
Okay. Awesome.
Take care and stay safe, eh?
Okay, I will. Oh my Lord.